Welcome, everyone. You can visit our website to find contact information, to be added to the mailing list, and to find the latest newsletter. You can also find newsworthy items on upcoming events in our UU community in our weekly updates as well. A reminder that people of all ages, children, young and old, are welcome here at UU across the service while being able to freely move about. After the service, stay for an in-person or virtual coffee break. Please take a moment to look at electronic devices. Now. This morning. We have an exciting announcement for everyone attending the service. We would like to stick around after the service for a brief congregation meeting workshop. During the congregational meeting, you'll have the opportunity to vote for our General Assembly delegates. We need to have at least 30 members participate either in person or online to make this vote valid. So we're literally the meeting we promise. During the workshop, we'll be exploring ideas related to the buildings that make up the physical space of the campus. Our volunteers can't wait to share and get your feedback on it. The Early Community Circle is sponsoring Groundhog Day potluck. Have you heard? One day past Groundhog Day on February 3rd, we'll have a potluck lunch. Bring your favorite dish to share, your napkin and your flatware. Sign up in the front of the room. That's 1 to 3 on February 3. We'll gather here in the sanctuary to laugh, to eat, to share. You're there. And from the LGBTQ Social Action Team. Thank you for Sterling from their service on queer elders this past fall. We're really excited to invite them back to present their Trans training. This training is for anyone who wants to build their skills to navigate the shifting notion of gender identity. As a welcoming and affirming congregation, we all could use the opportunity to build skills to help us relate to non-binary and transgender visitors and members. The presentation will be February 25th after the service. It's a free offering, but spaces and reserve your seat. So you can sign up on the sheet of the Social Action Committee board of call right up there, or speak to Angelica Triata, who is in the hallway. Unity Universalism is a liberal religious faith that cares no creed and welcomes all seekers. Whoever you are, whoever you love, wherever you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. You're guided by a set of principles and sources that encompass the three ways we can become and understand the world, the universe, and the divine. Our principles are important to us at UU Catskills, and we live our lives on a daily, our values on a daily basis. We are a welcoming and affirming congregation for the LGBTQ community. We are a congregational affiliate of the Ulster Immigrant Defense Network. We are an active voice in the efforts to address climate change. The sanctuary is built on the tribal land of the Lenape people, currently known as Kingston. Our prelude this morning is for the Captain Kennedy. No problem. Do we have any children this morning that would like to help us? Come on up. Please join me in saying the chalice lighting words that are found in your order of service. Light this chalice in grateful, loving community. Even in the darkest of times, may its flame light paths to courage, justice, and hope. It's an affirmation. May we be reminded here of our highest aspirations and inspired to bring our gifts of love to others. May we know once again that we are not isolated, but connected in wonder and joy to mystery and miracle in the universe, in the community, and in each other. Our words today are by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Through peaceful means, through dialogue, education, knowledge, and truth. Our reading this morning is approaching conflict by Reverend Tanya Martinez and read by Joanne Steele.
Approaching Conflict Like a Poem by Reverend Tanya Marquez. I joined a poetry class because a new acquaintance invited me to. I mostly joined so I could get to know her better. I was captivated the first day by the deep wisdom my professor shared. To me, it was like being at church. Every word he spoke found fertile soil in my heart. There were times when I felt myself overcome with beauty. The beauty I found in this class contrasted with the conflicts I was witnessing at work, in society, and almost everywhere. One Friday, as I listened to my teacher recite one of our poems, I wondered, what if I approached conflict like writing a poem? What if everyone did? Most of the time, conflict is reactive. People tend to do and say things before they've had a chance to process their emotions or to understand the entirety of the conflict. But I learned in my poetry class about carefully choosing words, not because they need to rhyme or to have a specific number of syllables, but because they need to be precise and beautiful. Poets are intentional about how to best deliver the message, how to best uncover the mystery of life, so that others can experience it. Silences matter too. Part of the message is to pause, to wait, to leave space to breathe before the next line. There's also the rhyme. A poem is a song, and songs can touch on difficult subjects too, but the rhythm, the melody matters. Since that moment, I've been wondering, what if the next time I find myself in the midst of conflict, I can slow down and imagine I am about to write a poem. Then conflict resolution or transformation would turn into a craft, a laboratory where beauty is created. There would be a slowing down that would help me connect with what I'm feeling, so I can find the right words to share that experience, and a silence to let me listen to the poem of the other.
Please stand if you are able and join in singing hymn number 389, found in your gray hymnal. We will sing this as a round, and Catherine and Kathy will. Mary. And Mary. 3 parts? Sorry, Mary.
All together first. Gathered here in the mystery of the hour, gathered here in one strong body, gathered here in the struggle and the power. Spirit, draw near first. Gathered here in the mystery of the hour, gathered here in one strong body, gathered here in the struggles and the power. Spirit, draws near the power. Gathered here in the mystery of the hour, gathered here in one strong body, gathered here in the struggles and the power. Spirit, draws near the tower. Gathered here in the mystery of the hour, gathered here in one strong body, gathered here in the struggles and the power. Spirit, draws near the power. Spirit, draw near.
I was having a great summer until Jeremy Ross moved into the neighborhood. I did not like Jeremy Ross. He laughed at me when he struck me out in the baseball game. He had a party on his trampoline, and I wasn't invited. Jeremy Ross was the only one the only person on my enemy list. I never even had an enemy list until he moved into the neighborhood. But as soon as he came along, I needed one. Dad understood. He understood stuff like enemies. He told me that when he was my age, he had enemies too. But he knew a way to get rid of them, and he was going to show me how. He pulled out a really old recipe book, and inside there was a worn out scrap of paper with faded writing. Here it is, enemy pie. You may be wondering exactly what is enemy pie. I was wondering too, but Dad said the recipe was so secret, he couldn't even tell me. I decided it must be magic. I begged him to tell me something, anything. I will tell you this, he said. Enemy pie is the fastest known way to get rid of enemies. I went out to play while Dad was cooking. Enemy pie was going to be awful. I tried to imagine how horrible it must smell, or worse yet, what it would look like. But when I was in the backyard looking for ladybugs, I smelled something really, really, really good. And as far as I could tell, it was coming from our kitchen. I was a bit confused. I went in to ask Dad what was wrong. Enemy pie shouldn't smell this good. But Dad was smart. If enemy pie smelled bad, your enemy would never eat it. I could tell he'd made enemy pie before. When it came out, it looked like plain old pie. It looked good enough to eat. I was catching on. But still, I wasn't really sure how this enemy pie worked. What exactly did it do to enemies? I asked Dad, but he was no help. He wouldn't tell me a thing. While the pie cooled, he filled me in on my job. He talked quietly. There is one part of enemy pie that I can't do. In order for it to work, you need to spend a day with your enemy. Even worse, you have to be nice to him. It's not easy, but that's the only way that enemy pie can work. And are you sure you really want to be part of this, though? Of course I was. All I had to do was spend one day with Jeremy Ross. Then he'd be out of my hair and out of my life for good. I rode my bike to his house and asked him to play. We rode bikes until his mom made us lunch. And then we went to my house and we played in the treehouse. Of course, I took down the enemy list. He wasn't being a very good enemy. I was beginning to think that maybe we should forget about the enemy pie. He stayed for dinner, and Dad brought out the pie. I watched as he cut it. Dad, it sure is a nice to have a friend, a new friend in the neighborhood. I was trying to get his attention and trying to tell him that Jeremy Ross was no longer my enemy. But Dad only smiled and nodded. I think he was just pretending. He passed the pie to me and Jeremy. It was at this point I panicked. I didn't want Jeremy to eat enemy pie. He was my friend now. I couldn't let him eat it. Jeremy, don't eat it! It's a bad pie. I think it's poisoned or something. He looked at me kind of funny and said, if it's so bad, why has your dad already eaten half of his? Good stuff, Dad mumbled, and then he laughed. Jeremy was happily eating. It seemed safe enough, so I took a tiny taste. Oh, enemy pie was delicious. After dessert, Jeremy rode his bike home, but not before inviting me over to play on his trampoline in the morning. As for enemy pie, I still don't know how to make it. And I wonder if enemies really do hate it, or if their hair falls out or their breath smells bad. But I don't know if I'll ever get to an answer because I just lost my best enemy.
It's now time for our offering. You can give in several ways. Drop something in the basket when it's passed. Use the QR code in your order of service, or give by going to uucatskills.org. We contribute to worthy organizations with our half-plate donations. This money will be shared among 7 charitable groups. Please give generously. We thank you for your gifts. This morning, I'd like to share one of my favorite UU stories. It takes place in the mid-'80s in a UU congregation in Ellsworth, Maine. But first, some context about queer issues in the '80s. Sometime in the Middle Ages, Christianity fabricated homophobia. Up until then, gender and sexuality was fluid, accepted, and even celebrated, but the church made it illegal. Those beliefs came to North America in colonial times and persisted until the 20th century. At the time of our story, Stonewall was only 20 years old. It was the very beginning of gay rights. It's hardly surprising that a queer person wouldn't feel welcome in a church, even a UU congregation. Oh, and it was the height of the AIDS crisis. Gail Geisenheimer was a 38-year-old lesbian living in a small town in Maine, driving a snowplow for a living and feeling very sorry for herself when a friend invited her to his church. He said it was different. Her experience with churches hadn't been very positive, and she rudely refused. All blanking churches are the same. They say they're open, but they don't want queer folk. To heck with church. She may have used stronger language. Her friend persisted. He knew his church was different. He told her his church cared about people, embraced diverse families, and worked to make a better world. He assured her she could come and not have to hide any elements of who she was. So she went. Oh, she went all right. And she dressed so carefully for her first Sunday visit. She spiked her short hair straight up into the air and dug out her heaviest, oldest work boots, the ones with the chainsaw cut that exposed the steel toe. She wore her torn blue jeans and her leather jacket, what we used to call dyke finery. I think we all had one of those outfits. There would not be a shred of ambiguity that Sunday morning. They would embrace her in her full Amazon glory, or they could fry ice. She carefully arranged her outfit so it would highlight the rock-hard chip she carried on her shoulder. She bundled up every shred of pain and hurt and betrayal she had harbored from every other religious experience in her life and lumbered into that tiny meeting house on the coast of Maine. Blue jeans and boots, leather jacket, spiked hair, and belligerent attitude. She accepted her friend's invitation and went to his church. She expected the gray-haired ladies in the foyer to step back in fear. That would have been familiar. Instead, they stepped forward, offered her a bulletin, a newsletter, and invited her to stay for coffee. It was so odd. They never even flinched. They called her dear. Stay for coffee, dear. She stayed for coffee. She stayed for Unitarian Universalism. Over time, the good folks of that church loved up the scattered parts of her and guided her from shattered to whole, from outcast to beloved among many. And those folks listened to her. She and her life partner, Celeste, became their poster children for the brand new Welcoming Congregation program. And they went on to provide important local pastoral and legislative ministries to gay folks in Down East Maine. They walked together and helped each other grow. Please don't think the transition was smooth or swift. These were not imaginary superheroes. They were human beings, and this was the mid-'80s. During the worship service on her second or third Sunday, a woman stood during Joys and Concerns to announce that all homosexuals had AIDS. All homosexuals were deviants who could not be trusted with children, public health, or civil society. All homosexuals should be quarantined, packed off to work camps to provide useful labor for society and keep their filthy lifestyle and deadly diseases to themselves. This would probably be a good place for all of us to take a deep breath. As the members spoke, Gail slowly sat upright from her customary slouch. She tucked in her arms, looked furtively around to see who might be glaring in her direction, and she tried to remember if she had parked her car facing in or out in the parking lot. In its journey of covenant, this congregation had just stumbled onto an important crossroad. But as joys and concerns unfolded, not one person made a reference to the call to quarantine all homosexuals. The pulpit that morning was ably filled by a student from the local seminary. At the end of the sharing, the seminarian made a brief comment to ensure them that not all sentiments voiced that morning represented the whole congregation. And that was that. At the time, what Gail remembers most was the sensation of holding her breath as she hurried out during the postlude. She ducked her head, avoided eye contact, spoke to no one, as though the shame was hers. There was a man in the foyer between her and the exit door. She quickly glanced up to his face, silently pleading for him to let her pass without more pain. He smiled, held the door open gently for her. Speaking softly, he said, "See you next week?" Her head snapped up. "Excuse me," she muttered. Surely she had not heard him correctly. He gently repeated, "See you next week?" Was he mad? Was he impaired? Had he just not heard what that woman said? See you next week? It was once a question and an invitation. Gail left that week right after service. But what about next Sunday? Would she go back? Why on earth would she go back? That would be, well, you fill in the blank. Going back would be what? Dangerous? Stupid? Foolhardy? Looking for trouble? Probably hurtful. But back she went. The next week, the regular minister was back. The service began as usual. Gail tensed up when joys and concerns were announced. Someone announced something like a birthday she couldn't fully remember. But she vividly remembered as one by one, folks at that congregation stood up and awkwardly announced that not everything said last week was right or true or representative of who they were as a Unitarian Universalist congregation. Something wonderful happened that morning in Maine, although at the time it didn't feel very good. This congregation in Ellsworth, Maine chose to journey into its covenant, and they had the skills to do so. The direction the congregation would take was being chosen. The congregation would not be stuck in conflict, mired in name-calling, or diverted from its gentle, steady trek toward building the beloved community. Their aspirations were unfolding, one voice at a time. The congregation had reached a crossroad where one among them had begun the use of language that would depersonalize and endanger others. She tried to create a class of less than human persons toward whom violence would be acceptable. The congregation gently refused to follow. But an even more extraordinary and wonderful thing happened. The congregation refused to depersonalize, refused to dehumanize the original speaker. The congregation stayed in an I-thou relationship with her. They did not start calling her name, that homophobe, that gay basher. None of that happened. While the speaker tried to turn homosexuals into objects to be manipulated, the congregation never referred to the speaker in a way that was less than embracing and respectful of her full humanity. And Gail, in the moment that the man on the foyer looked at her and said, "See you next week," Gail saw his soft smile, gentle words, and direct eye contact. Theirs was an I-thou encounter, the very thing that Gail had been seeking. Gail was in the throes of learning her first lessons of being in covenant with the congregation. When we covenant to walk together through all that life brings, it means when things get ugly, we don't walk away. And we may want to walk away, but our covenant calls us to abide and work things through. Gail's friend was right. His church was different. He did forget to tell her that at his church, some Sundays, she could be in for a wild, wild ride. But he was right. His church really cared about making things right for everybody. Something wonderful had happened that Sunday morning in Maine. So whatever happened to Gail Geisenhainer? Did she become the greatest snowplow driver in Maine? That part has been lost to history, so I don't know. But when something wonderful happens, it tends to spread. 10 years after she walked into that congregation in Ellsworth, Maine, she became an ordained UU minister. And 10 years after that, the Reverend Gail Geisenhainer gave a sermon based on her first experience in Ellsworth, Maine at General Assembly in front of over 3,000 people. It's generally considered one of the finest sermons ever delivered there. Her partner, Celeste DeRoche, is no slouch either. She was just as active in Unitarian Universalism, and she's known for her work detailing Unitarian Universalist history, primarily identifying the first out gay and lesbian UU ministers. And because of her work, I know that something else wonderful was going on that Sunday in Maine. Just down the street a bit in Augusta, our congregation there was being led by the Reverend Douglas Morgan Strong, the first openly gay Unitarian Universalist minister. This was Unitarian Universalism's blessing, all because Gail came back next week. As we heard in this morning's reading, often conflict is reactive. People say and do things before they've had a chance to process their emotions or to understand the totality of the conflict. In the throes of awful moments, in the slap of insult, the realizations of injustice, disrespect, unkindness, hatred, and worse, there is a way to detect if we are off course or on course. In these terrible moments, all sense of movement stops. Instinctively, some of us begin to hold our breath. We become hyper alert to details, the sense of other, and our sense of apartness. In our story, when the attack was made, all motion in the room appeared to stop. Gail hurried from the building, nearly holding her breath. Then the fellow at the door said, "See you next week?" At once a question and an invitation, at once an acceptance of the reality that she might not come back. See you next week? She exhaled, the saving power of breathing. Her first lesson on the beloved community where we walk together through all that life brings, just enough to keep us in motion, to keep us in conversation. Now I hate conflict. I prefer to just ignore it and hope it goes away, except that never works. Even worse, it can lead to conflicts being buried and then popping back up with amplified emotion. If handled correctly, even ugly, hurtful conflict may become a blessing. I've seen it happen here in our own congregation. A few years ago, a couple of our queer members were deeply hurt by the actions of some other members. To make it worse, our leadership, including me, didn't handle the conflict well. Suddenly, old hurts and slights were no longer dormant. It easily could have divided our congregation, I them instead of I we. Our minister helped gradually turn things around. We talked, we listened. We talked and listened. We talked and listened over and over again. As a result, we saw new programs. In the last 2 years, we started a small group ministry for LGBTQ members and allies, introduced rainbow face masks, added more LGBTQ services to our calendar, activated our social action team, installed a pride flag at the entrance to our sanctuary, added our pronouns to our new name tags, and started using our pronouns when we introduce ourselves, made our bathrooms gender neutral, attended Pride in place of our usual Sunday service, started a queer social group, offered transitioning and name-changing ceremonies to the greater community. And we saw an increase in LGBTQ visitors. This was our blessing. None of this probably would have occurred if that hurtful action hadn't happened, and if we hadn't had someone in our congregation to walk us towards healing. Something wonderful had happened here too. Within our own religious communities, we have all too many breath-stopping moments. We stay stuck in the conflict. We lose sight of our larger aspirations. We forget to include one another on the lists of folks to respect. Sometimes we all too cavalierly toss around flippant comments that hit like nerve bombs. When we depersonalize and demean one another, most anything that follows will be flawed in some way. When we catch ourselves out of rhythm with our values, we can stop and rebalance. We can backtrack, retreat to the last place on the path where we remember regarding one another with goodwill. This is a spiritual practice. We are here to practice this faith with all its rigorous demands. We are here to build this faith, expanding its broad possibilities. We are here to celebrate living. We are here to make life better. Wonderful things just don't happen on Sundays in Maine. Let us build a beloved community that respects the labors and aspirations of the past, but trusts the dawning future more. Let us build our own wonderful moments. See you next week. We'll have a meditation. We'll have a few minutes of silence. Please stand if you are able and join in singing hymn number 1037, found in your teal hymnal. If you're not familiar with this hymn, it's sort of like a call and response. Catherine will play the.
Yes.
And
You'll be singing the same thing each time.
for remaining silent when a single voice could have made a difference.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We cannot carry
For each time that our fears have made us rigid and inaccessible.
Forgive ourselves and each other.
For each time we have struck out in anger without just cause.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again.
For each time that our greed has blinded us to the needs of others.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For the selfishness that sets us apart and alone.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For falling short of the admonitions of the Spirit.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For losing sight of our unity.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For those and for so many acts, both evident and subtle, which have fueled the illusion of separateness.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
Our closing words are also by the Reverend Tanya Marquez. Compassionate One, may we remember to slow down when we find ourselves having difficult conversations. May we remember to treat those moments of conflict as an opportunity to create with one another a deeper understanding and something new where tension is now present. Please join me in the words for extinguishing our chalice. Extinguish chalice.
Not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. From you I receive, to you I give. Together we share, and from this we live. From you I receive, to you I give. Together we share, and from this we live.
See you next week. Don't forget to stay for our congregational meeting at 11:45.